There's a trend in today's church to create children's worship services on Sunday morning. Now, before we talk about beginning a children's worship service, there's some questions that you need to ask yourself, because having a children's worship service is not a fit for everybody. It's not something that every church needs to have. So the first question you need to ask is, does my church need a children's worship service? Is this something we need? Is this something my pastor wants? Is this something our parents want? How is this going to help? What are the advantages and disadvantages of having a children's worship service? You need to ask yourself, will having a children's worship service help my church reach our community? You see, having a children's worship service is not just about meeting the needs of the families that you have right now. It's also about meeting the needs of guests who might come, and perhaps guests who are not used to sitting in a worship service with children that have never been at a church service before. Is this going to help you reach your community? Another question that you need to ask is this the best and most healthy option for the children of our church? Is this what's best for our kids? And then the last question, does my pastor support having a children's worship service? Now, this is very key. If your pastor wants a children's worship service, it's going to be very important on whether or not you create one, or if your pastor doesn't want. Now, your pastor may want the children to be in the worship service with him simply because he feels like they need to be connected with him, or simply because he feels like that what he's going to do is going to minister not just to the parents, but to the children as well. And I've seen pastors that do an incredible job ministering not just to adults, not just to youth, but ministering to all ages as well. Now, if you start a children's worship service, it doesn't mean that your pastor can't do that. There may be certain topics that he wants to address that he sees that your church needs to deal with that really are PG-13 topics. And so you need to begin this process by asking yourself these questions. Then once you've asked yourself these questions, you need to move to talking to your pastor and your church leaders about what their desire is, about the benefits and the disadvantages of having a children's worship service. And you'll find in every situation, you're going to have both advantages and disadvantages. The next question is to go to your parents. If your church leaders and your pastor, if they're in favor of looking into the possibility of creating a children's worship service, then you need to ask your parents some questions. And what I would advise is do a very simple, very brief survey with your families to ask questions such as this. Would you be interested in our church creating a kids' church or a children's worship service for grades? Then list the grades that you're considering having it. You know, some children's worship services, some churches do it for kindergarten through second grade. Others, it's it's up to third grade. There's other churches that have children's worship all the way up through fifth grade. And so be specific in what grade you would want to engage your kids with. And would they be interested in having this during our regular Sunday morning worship service? Then another question to ask your families is, how do you think this would benefit the children of our church? And then a third question, do you think this would help us reach new families in our community? Now, the key in these questions in this survey is really just to be brief and to the point. You're not trying to manipulate. Never, never, never follow a pattern of trying to manipulate or don't do a survey if you really don't care about the opinions that you're going to get. And so the purpose of the survey really is to find a genuine, honest evaluation of what your parents feel about this opportunity. And so you want to express the reasons in it of why you're considering a children's worship service. And also you need to realize that you're going to get both positive and negative feedback. So for example, your purpose might be, we want to survey the families that would be directly affected by the creation of a children's worship service to hear their opinions and to see how many of them would desire a children's worship service. Now, here's some sample responses that you might get, and these are actually samples from an actual survey that we did before creating a children's worship service. Responses for or in favor of a children's worship service, here are some that we received. I wish we would have done this when my children were younger. Just tell me a time to help and I'll be there. I want it. I think this would help our families be more consistent in our worship service attendance. I think this would meet the needs of our children. Children need a solid foundation earlier today than with previous generations because they face more at an earlier age. I think this would help our church grow. There were many other responses, such as sounds great and good idea, let me know how I can help, even one offer of a financial support inside this survey. Then there were responses against the creation of a children's worship service as well. And these are ones that you will probably see if you do a survey too. And so one statement was, being with family in a worship service sets a tradition. I wouldn't use it for my children. I'd rather have a children's message during the worship service so children would realize that a worship service is for them as well. Children may seem like they are not listening, but the things they hear come up at home. Right now, the Sunday morning worship service is the only one that children are exposed to. Should we take this away from them? And so at the point where you've asked your parents and you've received both positive and negative feedback, you really need to sit down and make a list that you can present to your pastor and your church leaders, considering the very honest, genuine advantages and disadvantages of having a children's worship service. You need to be honest about the effects that it's going to have on your families, the effects it's going to have on your children, on the relationship it might have with your kids and your pastor. For example, if you have a church and the only time your kids are really there is Sunday morning and you take them out of the children's worship service, they're never going to be exposed to your pastor. They're not really going to know who their pastor is. Now, in some churches, that's okay. The pastor's okay with that. You're okay with that. The families are okay with that. In other churches, that is very not okay. And so at that point, you need to figure out advantages, disadvantage. If this is a disadvantage, then what are the solutions to the disadvantages that we have? For example, here's a list of advantages and disadvantages that we used actually during a creation of a kids' church at a church that we were once at. Advantages, here's how we listed them. Advantages to a children's worship service would be to create ways that parents can help without having to do a lot of preparation, something that can be an entry point into the children's ministry. It would allow our pastor to freely address PG-13 issues from the pulpit on Sunday mornings without criticism that children are present. Help our church to move more specifically to address the issues and needs that children are facing and that are challenging our culture. This would allow us to create multiple opportunities of service for our older children where they could lead and share through drama, puppets, testimonies, etc. This would allow guests a great convenience that some are specifically looking for inside a church. Now, disadvantages. A children's worship service would take children out of the Sunday morning worship. Children would not be worshiping on Sunday morning with their families. Children might not feel closely connected to our pastor. The addition of a children's worship service will increase the amount that is spent in the children's ministry concerning budget. Items will be needed for stage, illustrations, etc., and you would list the things that you specifically know that you would need for a children's worship service. So then we listed our solution options. Now at this point, we knew that most of our families were in favor. In fact, in this situation, there were only 2 families in the church that very strongly opposed a children's worship service, and this was a large church. Now there were others that were silent on the issue, but 2 that were very outspoken, and so we created solution options. Children would still attend the Sunday evening worship service. Now, that was an answer to that children would never be in worship. They would never have the exposure to sitting in a worship service. And personally, I feel this very important, that our children, that we don't wait until they are youth to actually go into a worship service. They need the opportunity to worship with their families. They need to see how their mom and dad worship. They need to see what happens in a worship service. Another thing that we did in this situation, we set up our kids' church actually to explain to the kids what happens in every worship service. And so every feature that you found in our adult worship service, you also found in our kids' church, but you found it on a kids' level, and then we would often throughout the year explain, this is why we give an offering. This is why we sing songs. This is why we do the certain things that we do. So that by the time our kids, in this case, when they were 3rd graders and they went into worship service with their moms and dads, they would understand, oh, this is why we do these things. Because for 3 years they had been hearing, oh, this is why we sing. This is why we give an offering. This is why such and such happens in a worship service. Other solutions, we could have, we weren't making promises here, but we said we could have a family day once a quarter where the messages would be G or PG rated, and on this Sunday, all of our children would attend Sunday morning worship with their family. In other words, a family-friendly worship service once every quarter, once every certain amount of time. We also listed children's worship would be optional. In other words, we're not going to make our parents take their kids to kids' church. This is something the parents can choose to do with their families, or they can choose not to do. They can have their kids with them in worship, or if it helps, if they see it's a benefit to their family, they can have them in children's worship. Now, in this situation, one of those two families that was very highly opposed to children's church came to me, and they simply said, we appreciate the option, but you've got to understand, if all of their friends are in a kids' church, they're going to want to be there as well. And so if you start a kids' church, even though we feel it would be best for our kids to be with us in worship, we understand that that's probably not going to happen because they're going to want to be with what's going on in the children's. They're going to hear about it in Sunday school. They're going to hear about it with their friends. And so even though we were creating an option, and I like this option a lot, and despite that one family's opinion, I've seen families use this very well to say, we're glad you have a children's worship service. We understand that new people coming to our church whose kids have never been in church before, this could be a real benefit to them, but it doesn't fit with us. And so we're going to go to worship as a family. And I respect that. I think that's great. And I think it's great to have it optional. Then we also listed that our pastor could visit our children's worship service from time to time for a brief time just at the beginning. That way it doesn't take him actually out of worship. So our kids could feel connected to him and maybe even connected to him in a different way and in a stronger way because it would be more personal and it would be more specific to them. And so those were some of the advantages and disadvantages that we listed in that specific situation. Now, at this point, once you've decided, yes, we're going to move forward with a children's worship service, you've got to decide what kind of children's worship service is going to benefit us best. And so there's some questions that you need to answer here. For example, how long will the children's worship service last? Now, some of this has to do with structure. Some of this has to do with simply how you want to work it. Some children's worship services, the best way to do it are when parents come to worship, they check their kids in to the children's worship service, and then they go to worship. So the kids are never actually in the worship center. Other churches, they want their kids in the worship center for the first part. Then they hit a certain point in the worship service where they dismiss all the children. The children follow leaders out, and they go to kids' church or to children's worship. And that works for some situations. You have to take into consideration check-in, check-out, security, and those things vary with each church's situation. So a matter of, another thing you need to look at there is how is this going to affect our worship service? Because that's one more thing you need to plan in every worship service. I mean, you already have songs, you have offering. Well, now you've got to have a dismissal time. Is that going to be an interruption to the flow of your worship service? Another question to ask is, do you always want to have a children's worship service? Is this going to be year-round? There was one church where we began a children's worship, and it was not year-round. What we did is we ran a fall semester and a spring semester. This allowed our children to be in worship with their families, basically from Thanksgiving to the middle of January. It was a season that was off. It allowed us to retool. It allowed us to keep kids' church very fresh, allowed our kids to worship with their parents during Christmas time. And then we would end in the spring. The last Sunday that they were in school was the last Sunday of kids' church. And beginning with Memorial Day weekend all the way through Labor Day weekend, they would be in family worship. And so the summertime, it was another opportunity for them to be with their families. Basically, it broke down. We had 26 weeks where they were in kids' church and 26 weeks where they were not. We had a short fall semester, a longer 16-week spring semester, and then they had 26 weeks split up winter and summer where they were with their families. And in that church, it worked very well. Now, it took a lot of communication to let the families know this is when we're starting. This is when it's coming back. It was something we continually had to keep out there so that our parents were never surprised. And it finally became a pattern that they were used to, that we were able to just continue. Another question that you want to ask is, what kind of structure do you want to your kids' church to have? And so, for instance, do you want your style to be a video-driven style? and honestly, that's my least favorite. I think video can add some enhancements, but actually a video-driven where typically your most important key points and messages come through video is really my least favorite. There are some effective videos out there that can help you do that, but I really think the best way for kids to get a message is through somebody that they know, through hearing their heart, through a live presentation. So one style is the video-driven, and I know Saddleback Church in California used to use that option. I believe they still use that option. In fact, empoweringkids.com is a place where you can actually purchase some of the kids' church videos that they used. Another option is a facilitator-driven option. And this is really one of my favorites, simply because you have one person that keeps it flowing, that keeps it going, but they don't necessarily do all the teachings. So picture that your kids' church is broken into different segments. You've got your segment that introduces the kids' church rules, that introduces the topics, introduces the key verse, the Bible story. You've got all these different, and you think of it as segments. And maybe a different person leads each segment. Maybe the facilitator leads some of those segments, but maybe you have different parents, different volunteers, and each one's leading a different segment, and the facilitator is the one that keeps it all going. So he's the glue that ties all of these segments together. Another option is a plot-driven. In other words, it's more like a drama or a play that kind of interweaves. North Point Church in Georgia, they use this style and produce a curriculum for it as well in the 252 Basics curriculum. And so anyway, once you decide what kind of children's worship service fits you best, communicate this with your families, with your pastor, your church leaders. You'll also want to communicate what kind of space you need, what kind of budget you're going to need, as well as how you're going to communicate this to the community, how are you going to communicate it to your parents, what the launch date is going to be, as well as the name that you want to use. And your name is really important. You want your name to become a brand. In other words, when parents hear it, when people in the community hear it, that they immediately know exactly what you're talking about. And so it needs to be a name that really carries the idea of what you're trying to convey. And there's a couple of ways to approach a name. One is they hear the name, and it's like a website name. You want a website name to really reflect who you are and what you do. And so in one church, we simply called Kids Church. Kids Church. It was as simple as that. Another church, we had a children's worship service that was for 3rd through 5th graders, and we called it preteen worship. And in other words, the name was exactly what it was. I've also seen it where names were given. For example, 24/7 was the name of a kids' church. It was based off Exodus 24/7. And Exodus 24/7 says, we will do and obey everything that the Lord has commanded. And so that was their key verse. And when they actually presented their plans for a kids' church, they actually presented along with that the theological background for having it. And so, for instance, they listed biblical foundations for 24/7. Children's worship would be built around 5 key elements: believe Him, know Him, obey Him, love Him, share Him. 3 of these 24/7 verses would eventually be put on the back of the children's worship room. And so they took these 5 different key elements, and each one was based off of a 24/7 verse out of the Bible. So for example, 1, we want kids to believe Him, Luke 24/7. The Son of Man, Jesus, must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and the 3rd day rise again. We want kids to know Him, Jeremiah 24/7. I will give them a heart to know me, that I am the Lord, and they will be my people, and I will be their God. We want kids, 3, we want kids to obey Him, understanding, as Jesus said, that those who love Him obey Him. And that's based off of, in parentheses, John 14:21. And that part of obeying Him is to share Him, in parentheses, Acts 1:8. And the verse they used for this, the 24/7 verse, was the Exodus 24/7, their main verse. And they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. And so what they did is these 5 key elements, 3 of them came from 24/7 verses: believe Him, know Him, and obey Him, from Luke 24/7. Jeremiah 24:7 and Exodus 24:7. And then the last two were to love him and share him, basically as a result of obeying him. And they were based off John 14:21 and Acts 1:8. So they weren't all based off 24/7 verses, but the idea is there. They came up with a name, and then they used the name to actually lay out the biblical foundation for this is the reason why we're going to have children's worship. This is what we want our kids to learn. In other words, they clearly communicated with their church and their families from the beginning their purpose and their desire in creating a children's worship service. Then when it comes time, you've decided you're going to have a children's worship service. You've talked to your pastor, your leaders, your parents. You've surveyed them. You've come back to your leaders with a proposal. Here's how we're going to do it. This is what we need. This is what it's going to take. This is going to be our launch date. This is going to be our name. Then, once the decision's made, you need to figure out how and what you're going to communicate to your families. So, for example, you want to communicate the same things that you did in your proposal. Your name, your launch date, what time it's going to be, how long it's going to be. You also want to communicate to them what style you're going to use, what your purpose is. And you could list it in the same way that we once did by saying, our purpose in creating a children's worship is to help in reaching unchurched people so that moms and dads whose first grader has never been in church don't have to be distracted or concerned about what people around them might think. Instead, they can concentrate on what God is saying to them. To teach younger children the purpose behind all the elements of a worship service and to prepare them to worship with the church as a whole. To teach life lessons that coordinate with the Sunday school curriculum to help further them in their discipleship process. To free up additional space for adults in the Sunday morning worship services. To maximize the time in which children this age are at church. In other words, maximizing the time means they're already there for this amount of time. We want to maximize that use to more specifically teach and give application to the biblical things that they're hearing and learning. Then we listed the biblical foundations for what the kids would learn, and as well as answering the questions that we knew our parents would want to know. They'd already seen the survey. They already knew we were considering it. And then at this point, we communicated to them the answers to the questions that we knew that they would ask. Now it comes time, you're coming up to your launch date. How are you going to promote your children's worship service? Well, you want to come up with a promotional description, just a little promotional tagline that you can use either in your community, your bulletin, emails. And it's good to have a longer one that's more specific to churched people and a shorter one that would be more like a Twitter description. Here are some of the longer ones that we've used in the past. Kids love Kids Church. Through fast-paced songs, relevant teaching, funny and true life stories, powerful illustrations and allusions, children learn Bible stories and key verses and how these apply to their daily lives. They also get to enjoy a snack, and we always need a spinner and a picker for our round-the-world missions moment. And don't be surprised if a puppet peeks out from time to time. Here's another sample. Children learn best and enjoy themselves more when teaching methods are varied. Sunday mornings present a variety of activities designed to teach biblical truths and to build a foundation for following Jesus in every day in every way. Caring teachers and workers involve themselves in the lives of children as they minister on a child's level. During children's worship, children grow closer to the Lord through games, activities, crafts, video features, role play, and other fun learning experiences. There's no better way for your child to enjoy coming to church than to get them plugged in on Sunday mornings. They'll love it. A third example says this. Take everything you love about a church service, drop in a bit of slime time, add about a gallon of Dr. Pepper to it, and you've got our preteen worship service that will encourage children to become fully devoted followers of Christ. This fast-paced, engaging, and fun time will challenge your 3rd through 5th graders to know the Lord and to make Him known. Preteen worship also includes a weekly dive time that aims at teaching our preteens how to spend quality time with the Lord every day. The message is also presented using a variety of tools. Through illustrations, illusions, testimonies, competitions, stories, and truths straight out of God's Word, your student will be challenged with a relevant message about living for Christ every day in every way. So much fun, so little time, your student won't want to miss it. So figure out the best way that you want to promote a children's worship service. And from there, We will go to our next session, which is simply how to lead a children's worship service. And so right now we're going to come to the end of this segment, but join us in the next segment for actually the hands-on, once you're inside that children's worship, how to organize it, how to plan it, how to lead it.